Good morning once again. My name is John Piggott, as many of you will know by now, and it is my privilege to chair this final session. We have three very diverse and very distinguished speakers whose first names all begin with A, to talk about different pension risks that are with us or are upcoming. The first speaker is Andrew Cairns, and he is going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on higher age mortality. As with the other sessions, it's 20 minutes each, and then we'll have a Q&A. Thank you.
As the title says, I'll be talking about COVID-19 and with a focus more on higher age mortality, but there'll be some discussion of younger age groups as well. So the plan for this session, I'll just briefly introduce what the objectives were in the research that we were doing. It'll be splitting into two parts. So the first part, I will be looking at the demographics of the COVID-19 victims, primarily thinking about the mortality rates, but then there will also be some discussion of infection rates, and then thinking about how, during 2021, how did vaccination have an impact on infection rates and hospitalizations, and also ultimately mortality. And then alongside vaccinations, we've also had to think about the different variants that have come along from time to time. So what sort of impact have they had on the various stages of infection through to death? And then I'll talk about the demographics of the surviving population. So what was the impact of on life expectancy of this pandemic? And that question arose because the thought in people's minds was that the people who were most likely to die if they got infected would be people who were already in poor health, and so the surviving population might therefore be healthier. So there was potentially a selection effect, and so what we wanted to try to do was to measure that. So this chart is just briefly showing you what has happened in terms of the pandemic in England. And in that chart, you can see the different waves of infection and deaths. And so in the first wave, in the first April, May and June in 2020, this was a case where the pandemic swept through the whole of the country, and all of the different regions. There are 9 regions here that are plotted, so 9 lines. And all of the peaks are roughly lined up. However, what is different between the different regions is the size of that peak. So one of the takeaways from that on its own, that first wave, was that although the timing was similar, that the pandemic had a different impact on different parts of the country. And it's London was the one that had the highest number of infections per 100,000 of population compared to other regions, but that was 170% higher than the southwest. And then in the second wave at the end of 2020 and 21, so in the autumn, there was a bigger wave in the north of England compared to the south, and then a new variant came along in December, which we call or is now called the Alpha variant, that picked up, and there was a bigger peak for all of the different regions. So there's quite a lot of variation, therefore, that we're seeing in terms of timing, but also in terms of the magnitude of that pandemic. And that's just something to be thinking about. That's now in the past, of course, but if you're thinking about potential future pandemics, that you really need to be aware of these considerable variations between different regions. And part of that is to do with urban and rural variation between different parts of the country. That urban areas people are closer together, and therefore the spread of infection is likely to be higher. Now this chart is looking at death rates during the first wave and the second wave. So there are 2 red lines, which are wave 1 and wave 2, and these are by age, showing the death rates from COVID. And then there was a statistician in the UK called David Spiegelhalter who put up a plot of this type. And his observation was that quite how strikingly similar the COVID mortality rates were in terms of the shape, not the level, but the shape. So this is on a logarithmic scale. It's a sort of Gompertz type of mortality curve for those of you who know that. And it's this almost parallel relationship between the two that was the striking feature. Now, what this then led us to start thinking, because we were trying to model and understand the data. So we're interested in thinking about the COVID mortality rate as it's linked to age. And it led us to break it down in the following way. So first of all, we already know from past pre-pandemic years, we know what all-cause mortality looks like. Also in the pandemic, we can measure the infection rate, and so the COVID mortality is clearly going to be related to, in some sense, to those. And then just as a sort of balancing term in this equation, there's something that we call relative frailty. And this relative frailty, which I'll come back to a bit later on, this is measuring the probability of death from COVID relative to the annual probability of death from all causes in a normal year. And that graphic that we were looking at before, that's kind of suggesting as a starting point that the combination of infection rate times relative frailty, that varies only slowly with age. But we can generalize that further, and this is taking into account the other observations that we got early in the pandemic, that even when you look at people of the same age, there would often be, if it was being reported that somebody had died, they would often say, well, this person had underlying problems, comorbidities. And so this led us to generalize the model so that it's not that the death rate is not just a function of age, but it also depends on the socioeconomic group that you belong to, as well as potentially other groups. So things like neighborhood deprivation, or the urban-rural mix, or the ethnic group. And the hypothesis that we had was that the balancing term, the relative frailty in that equation, that doesn't vary much by age, so that's what we saw before, but more importantly, in the work going forward, was that this relative frailty does not also vary much by the subgroup that you're in. And therefore, when you see differences, and in particular inequalities in terms of COVID death rates, that is really down to existing inequalities in all-cause mortality, but also differences between these socioeconomic groups in terms of infection rates. So COVID was really just highlighting existing inequalities rather than exacerbating them. Now, just focusing on some of these components, so with infection rates, there was a study which was done during the summer of 2020. And what they found was that in the first wave, about 6% of adults had been infected. But importantly, they found that there was relatively little variation by both age and sex. And also, importantly for our purposes, relatively little variation by deprivation. But what we've also seen in the earlier charts with death rates was that there was significant variation by region. Moving on to mortality rates, the UK's Office for National Statistics had published some very interesting data where they had looked at age standardised mortality rates by both deprivation and separately by region. And so we were able to use that to separate out regional effects from deprivation effects. So this chart here shows the results of that. So it's a little bit complex to explain, but what we're looking at here, the x-axis has the numbers 1 to 10. So these are the deprivation deciles, with group 10 being the least deprived, group 1 being the most deprived, and the y scale here is the excess mortality relative to the least deprived group 10. And the grey bars are showing the all-cause mortality, so that for this, the age range that we're looking at here, the most deprived group has mortality that is 100% higher. So it's double the mortality rates of people in group 10. And now the blue bars are showing the raw statistics by deprivation, and it was looking like there was more inequality due to COVID. But our analysis, in our analysis, we were able to filter out the regional effects because there was a concentration of infection in London, which also had higher levels of deprivation. So the orange bars in this chart are actually showing the results of the inequality, but with the regional effects filtered out. And what you can see here is that the orange bars are pretty much well aligned with the grey bars. So that really, this what we're seeing here is down that line at the bottom, is that the relative frailty in that equation that I was talking about, that varies very little across the deprivation deciles. And so therefore, what we were then thinking was that the lethality of the COVID virus was really very much dependent on your individual physical or medical frailty. It's nothing at all to do with what socioeconomic group you're in. It's really just, are you healthy or unhealthy? And then your prospects, if you get infected, are then linked to that individual frailty. Now, in terms of 2021-22, we then sort of had vaccination beginning, and things just generally became more complex. So vaccination was one part of that. So we started off with the oldest age groups and then gradually working down to the younger age groups over the course of the year. We also had new variants coming along, Alpha, Delta, and Omicron being the prominent ones. And then we want to think about what are the impacts at different ages on infection rates, hospital admissions, and also deaths. So by the end of 2020, all of these different types of statistics were being published on a frequent basis, generally weekly, by the Office for National Statistics. So that helped us immensely in terms of thinking about these things like inequalities and so on. So out of the many things that I could show you, this is just one chart showing, which is designed to show the impact of the wave of vaccination starting at the older groups, working their way through to the younger groups. So there's a variety of lines. So down at the bottom, you have the average age of those who are infected week by week. And you can see a sort of a slow dip over the year. Starts a bit high at the end of 2020, it falls and then picks back up. The most striking one is the hospitalization average age. So that's the orange line going across the middle of that chart. And the average age for hospitalization is much higher because once you're infected, you're much more likely to then go into hospital if you're in the older age groups. So it starts off high when nobody was vaccinated. But as vaccination came in and started off and working its way through the older groups, the people who were ending up in hospital were getting much younger and younger. And so there's a drop of about 20 years. And most of that is because of the impact of vaccination. So in my mind, my interpretation of these particular charts was that vaccination was helping a little bit in terms of preventing you from being infected, but it really had a much bigger impact in terms of the keeping you out of hospital. And then up at the top, the blue and the red are for males and females, and these are the average age at death, where, there's some effect there, but not quite as big as the hospitalization one. Now, this is more complex still. So this is looking at if you get infected, do you get hospitalized, and then do you die? So I won't dwell too much on this, but again, you can see that there are definitely impacts in terms of, and this is by age now, and you can see impacts in terms of a bunching up. So if you look at the hospitalization chart on the left-hand side, there's a broader spread which then narrows by the middle of the year, and that narrowing across age groups, that is reflecting the fact that the older people in the population have been vaccinated and the younger ones have not. But I could talk for hours on this chart, but I won't do because I'm constrained for time. But we can then move on. We can use all of these different statistics to get back to this relative frailty. And so the relative frailty on this chart, so it starts off around about 1 on the left-hand side, and that 1 can be interpreted in the following way. That if you got, in 2020, if you were infected, then your probability of dying from COVID was the same as the probability of dying from all other causes during that year. And you can see it started off at 1 and has gradually declined. There's also a bit of a bunching up because of vaccination in the middle of 21, but really a steady decline, so that by the first couple of months of 2022, we're now at a level where if you get infected, the chances of dying are 1/20th of what they were in the first year of the pandemic. So that's partly vaccination, but it's also partly, I haven't really talked about it, it's also partly due to the different variants that have come along and have been less lethal. So first, now thinking about just in the last few slides, just thinking about the impact on future mortality and trying to model this selection effect. So as a starting point, we have a typical, for a cohort age 75, this is a typical curve of deaths. So the curve gradually builds up and it sort of peaks in terms of numbers of deaths in the sort of late 80s, and then it gradually declines. Now, in amongst all of this group, there are some people who are less healthy, some are more healthy, and so under this curve, it's not, the people are different. They're not all the same. It's a heterogeneous group. And so the people who are currently less healthy, they're more likely to feature at the sort of left-hand side of that graph, and then the people who are currently more healthy, they would feature more at the right-hand side. So that's the starting point. Now let's think about how does COVID fit into that. So if you had somebody that was, say, 5% that were going to die from this cohort, so that's very much exaggerated so that you can see what's going on. If you chose that 5% at random, you would have the left-hand chart. And so that's the grey section up at the top above the pink region, who are the survivors. Now, that's choosing people at random, but if we take into mind this idea that comes from the proportionality that we saw before and the anecdotal evidence about comorbidities, then really the grey region, the people who are dying from COVID, that needs to be front-loaded and towards the left-hand side of that chart. So that's what we tried to do in terms of our modelling work. And so to pick up that grey region, to model that, we just used a very simple approach to take that DTX, that deaths curve, and then we overlay on that a proportion who die from COVID. And that proportion was modelled using an exponential curve, just a very simple curve. There wasn't a biological basis for that. It was just something simple in order for us to get some insight. And there were two parameters in this. One of them was the amplitude parameter, which is simply related to the number of deaths. And then there's another parameter called the reach, which is really determining the shape of that exponential curve. But that reach parameter is also related to the heterogeneity within a cohort, how much variation is there in the health of that cohort. But it's also related to the years of life lost from those who die from COVID. So there's a couple of experiments that we did, and I'll maybe skip this one and go straight on to the impact on life expectancies. So we looked at some more realistic scenarios and by looking at the total numbers of deaths and roughly matching that to what we have observed in terms of deaths in the United Kingdom. So a couple of scenarios with either 120,000 deaths or 180,000 in the United Kingdom. And the chart on the left-hand side for the different scenarios is showing what is the percentage change, the impact on life expectancy of the pre-pandemic relative to the post-pandemic. So because we've got a slightly healthier population that survive, everything else being equal, there would be an increase in life expectancy. But this is a percentage increase, and if you look at the scale, up at the top, that's just a 1% increase, and that's for the very highest ages. So in other words, the takeaway here was that the impact on the life expectancies of the surviving population was actually very small, and a lot less than people had suspected. But that was in the absence of secondary effects, and this is the big unknown at the moment. This is just thinking about long COVID is one example of that. So how big a problem is that? how long will long COVID persist for. But there are other things like late cancer diagnoses or delayed treatment, lasting impact of innovation during the pandemic, which is more on the positive side, behavioural changes, which again could be positive or negative, might be getting exercise, it might be home working, things of that sort. There might be increased long-term unemployment, maybe an economic impact on future health spending and research and so on. So there are lots of things that need to be thought about in the coming years. We also have to think about other secondary effects in terms of other causes of death. So we might, as I've already mentioned, see higher cancer death rates, but then getting back to more normal levels. But conversely, we might see lower death rates. So in the data that we have already for the last couple of years, we can see lower death rates from pneumonia because people have been social distancing and so on. And pneumonia death rates have been about 50% of what they were pre-pandemic. So just to summarise, we've seen a strong relationship between COVID mortality rates and all-cause mortality. This is a proportionality hypothesis. We've seen significant variation by region and urban and rural, much more than a normal year. And in the absence of secondary effects, the impact of the pandemic on life expectancy of survivors is going to be quite small. But we need time just to understand the nature and the magnitude of these secondary effects. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was absolutely fascinating. Our next speaker is Balter from Tilburg. She's worked for a long time with NetSpar and worked extensively on pensions. And she is going to be talking about macro-longevity risk.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present over here. So indeed, I will present work, or actually several papers, which I combine here, each addressing longevity risk to some extent. And in particular, the main part of the presentation is based on a paper together with my Danish co-authors, Marlene Kallestrup-Lam from Aarhus University. And as such, we are in there investigating the choice between annuity products and the Danish pension sector. So in this session, we are asked to present about risks within pensions. So let me first address, which you all know already, the challenges that most pension systems in the world are facing, which is the historical low interest rates that we are having, the increases in life expectancies, and also the fulfillment of the Solvency II capital requirements. And these challenges altogether make, in particular, defined benefit schemes very expensive. And therefore, we see this global transition towards defined contribution schemes. And that's also the case, or mainly the case, in Denmark and also in the Netherlands. So even though the Dutch and the Danish systems are referred to as the best in the world, or actually, well, back in 2017, when I started this research together with my Danish co-authors, the Danish was still number one. And after this comparison paper, apparently they told us quite some tricks, because then when the paper was published, we were number one. But I think that, I don't know whether Iceland is represented over here, because this year they were, for the first time in the system, they were compared and they are the number one. So, as I said, both the Danish and the Dutch systems are ranked among the best, but still they face these challenges. And we see, therefore, a shift from safe pension products to more risky pension products. Or in particular, we see a shift from who is facing the risk. So the risk is moved from the provider to the individual. And that is happening in both countries, or was happening. So let me go into a little bit of detail. So in Denmark, the majority of the pension products used to have a historical minimum guarantee, so a minimum guaranteed interest rate, so minimum return that everyone would get on their pensions, and this was ranging between 0% nowadays actually to up to 4.5%. So you would always get at least that return on your account, and even with the potential of getting more than that. And because of the low interest rate environment, that meant that these products are very expensive, and all providers had to invest mainly in safe assets in order to make sure that they met this guarantee. And actually nowadays, some of these guarantees are not even sustainable anymore because they are higher than the risk-free rate. So that was the main characteristic of the products that they used to have in Denmark. And at the same time, also the mortality rates were fixed. So upon the initiation of the contract, the mortality tables that were showing the expected life expectancies and the mortality rates, they were fixed at that time, and it meant that any deviation later on would not change the pension payments of the individuals. So there was no risk for the individual. And they moved within the last 10 years to unguaranteed variable annuities, in which it was no longer minimum guarantee, so no minimum return anymore. And also, the longevity risk is now for the individual. So if the regulator is updating the mortality tables, then that will change the pension payments for the individuals, and it's their risk. So they move this explicitly now. And we actually had some data on that, on this switch. So most pension funds in Denmark, well, some, let me not say most, but some, they made the collective decision to move everyone from this guaranteed product to the unguaranteed, to the variable one. But some funds, they gave the policyholders the option. So they said, you're currently having this guarantee, do you want to switch to the unguaranteed? This will be beneficial for you because you can now invest in the financial market without any restrictions, because you no longer have to invest mainly in safe assets in order to match the guarantee. So you can fully exploit the risk-return trade-off. But there is also then the longevity risk that you will get. So if mortality rates will change, that's your risk. And if you switch to this new product, then you will also be compensated. And we have some data from the first switch that was offered to people from UP, a pension fund in Denmark. And in that paper, we have investigated who actually wanted to switch. And we have these characteristics of the people that prefer to give up the guarantee. And in particular, you could think, of course, of those with high level of guarantees. They are less willing to give their high guarantee up because it's worth quite a lot. And this is actually also the trigger for our main question here. How much should the compensation be that people are offered? And in particular, of course, the financial risk can be compensated, but how much is the longevity risk? What is it worth to have this longevity hedge implicitly in this guarantee? So how can we quantify macro longevity risk, which is something that will happen in the future, and even our best models today cannot anticipate on any deviations from the life expectancies that we currently have. So that is what I will focus on later. Another reason why we look at this macro longevity question is coming from the Dutch reform. So in the Netherlands, at the moment, we are, well, according to most others, we are having a DB contract, but that's actually not completely true because our contribution rate is fixed. So that doesn't really fit a DB scheme. And pension payments can actually increase or decrease depending on the funding ratio. So that actually means that we are having something which is more similar as a DC system, and we call it often a collective defined contribution scheme. And the thing is that most people thought that we had guarantees, that there were promises. And every year pensions were increased according to the inflation. But it was only until the crisis that we realized that our pensions were not guarantees. They could actually be decreased if the funding ratio was very low. And that happened only when we were back in 2008. So people lost their trust in the system, and we want to make the risks explicit. And that's why there has been a a lot of debate, a very long debate about pension reform. And now they agreed to move to a new system, which is called the new pension contract. Probably will get a different name later on, of course, when it's no longer new anymore. But at the moment, it's still new, because we are not even there. So the details still have to be figured out, but the government and the sector, they agreed on the main ingredients. And it is that everyone will have their own pension pot, no longer the funding ratio. Still there will be some solidarity in there, because there will be a possibility of having a collective solidarity reserve. And in the meantime, so up until 2025, we will be in transition, and we will move all the entitlements of the old system to individual accounts. So we will divide 1,800 billion euros. That's a large shift. And of course, what is important in this new contract is to inform people about the risks that they are facing. This will also help with the trust within the system, but it's important to not only quantify the expected pension payments people can get in the future, incorporating financial risk, but also all the other risks that are there, such as the mortality risk, the longevity risk. So what is it actually that I'm talking about when I talk about macro longevity risk? We can differentiate between idiosyncratic and systematic longevity risk. In idiosyncratic risk, micro longevity risk, it's just the risk that you as an individual don't know exactly when you die. So when you are with a small group, you will never live up to the exact percentage. But of course, if you have a very, very large group, then because of the law of large numbers, you can have that exactly, for instance, 90% of a group dies. So if you're, of course, by yourself, you can never die with 90% chance. But that risk can be diversified. So our main focus is on macro longevity risk, and which is the risk that even when we forecast our life expectancies and incorporate all the data and all the knowledge that we have today, and we forecast our future survival rates, then it can happen that next year we actually update our life expectancies and we live even longer than anticipated. So these unexpected changes, that is what we mean with macro longevity risk. So of course we already embed in our life expectancies that we will live longer. There is a positive trend. We know that we will live longer in the future. But if we even outlive that, that is the risk that we want to capture. Because regulators often prescribe the mortality tables that pension providers have to use. But in a few years' time, they typically update this, and then it can happen that there is a shock and we even live longer than we anticipated. So ex ante, we don't know what will happen. So this is also addressed in the literature. John, for instance, who is sitting next to me, he investigated this group self-annuitization, which is similar to the Dutch system with the funding ratio, and there it's also incorporated that a change in the expectations can happen, so a change in the mortality rates. And Marie, for instance, she has shown that people prefer to bear this risk as a group rather than to insure it, because the insurance is quite expensive because of the insolvency risk, because we cannot diversify this systematic risk. And also others have addressed the different types of risk that are within this longevity, because this also shows then that it's very difficult to quantify, because there are many different types of risk. There is model risk, basis risk, trend risk, volatility, etc. And if you only acknowledge or only use the data that you have up to the current time, then the stochastics within the model is not that large, according to a paper by Barthes, and it's negligible compared to financial risk. And that's, of course, very important. How much mortality risk is there compared to financial risk? Can we neglect it, or is it large? So in order to look at that, I want to show you one example on how this guaranteed product looks like and the variable contract. So one where we don't have the longevity risk for the individual, but we do have this guarantee on the financial risk and the other way around on the variable product. So here you see this guarantee. So in this example, the guaranteed return that you get is 1%, while the risk-free rate is 2%. So the dashed dotted line, that's the floor, so you can never get less than that. That's where you get a return of 1%. But you can invest the remainder wealth that you have in the risky asset. So you can get something more than that in expectation. That's the flat line that we see. Of course, and whatever you invest in the risky market, there is risk involved, so that's why we see the 95% confidence interval as well. So this is the fixed product or the guaranteed product, and there is no longevity risk. If we can invest in the risky asset without having the need to match this guaranteed return, then we can invest up to what we want. In this example, this investor is investing 35% of his assets, of his wealth in risky assets. And let's put them together. Then we see that the variable product gives an expectation, a higher pension, but of course there's more risk in there, and we can get below this floor the guaranteed return. But that's not the complete story, because in the variable product there is also macro longevity risk. Because if we now live longer than expected, then, or actually when the expectations change, when the mortality table gets updated in the future, that will cause lower or potentially higher pension payments. So imagine we have this Danish males, and we have data up to 2007. Then we can forecast the survival rates and calculate the life expectancies of a 67-year-old Danish man. And then we see that this Danish man will live another 15 years and 4 months. And we can also look at the conditional expectation of this 67-year-old man to live until he's 70, so conditional on him being 70 in 2010. He will live another 12 years and 5 months. But if we now take this 3 years of additional data into account, so we now have data not until 2007, but we have 3 years data extra, then we re-estimate our model, and we calculate the life expectancy of this 70-year-old man in 2010. Then he will actually live another 13 years and 8 months. So all of a sudden, he lives even longer than we thought. And that's exactly the macro longevity risk that I'm talking about. Of course, we can repeat this by adding more data into the future. And what will happen is this blue line. So if we would update our mortality forecasts every 3 years, then you will see these shocks. And you see that this risk is huge compared to the financial risk, or even outside the 95% confidence interval of this investor. So what I've shown now is the macro longevity risk ex post. So I'm looking backwards. But of course, when we want to do pricing, or when we want to communicate something about the future, we have to be able to say something about this risk ex ante. And we are currently working on this to look at the stochastics within the model. But of course, this is a little bit philosophical, because we don't know what kind of data will happen in the future. And that will, of course, drive our quantification of the longevity risk. We will then also combine that with the data that we now also obtained from these pension funds in Denmark, in which we have data on the compensation of how much they gave people when they switched to this product. And this switch didn't only happen in 2007, they repeated that question multiple times. So that's what we are currently working on, and looking for an ex ante quantification rather than this ex post one. And in the Dutch setting, that's also important for the communication, as I said. So hereby I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was very, very interesting. So we now have our third speaker, Anita Halvorssen, from Global Legal Solutions in the USA, which has also got a strong connection with the Norwegian, what used to be, I think it's called the Sovereign Wealth Fund now, it was once the Oil Fund, and she's going to be talking about ESG, environment, social governance, and she says with a particular emphasis on climate and how that ties in, right, to these financial risks. And I think this is very interesting in a pension context, because if you think of the pension membership, surely one of the risks they face relate to climate in their everyday lives, not just climate-related investment products.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation, Hazel. And I'm going to present on, my presentation's based on this paper, how the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund balances ethics, ESG risk, and returns, which I wrote for the Wharton Pension Research Council last year. That's going to be published in the fall. So today I'm basing it on this, but also looking at climate risk more thoroughly. So these are the topics, and so it's the Government Pension Fund Global is the name of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, the official name. And it is the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, and one of the largest institutional funds. Currently over $1.1 trillion. That's a couple of days ago. It changes. In December, it was 1.4 trillion. So it's quite a big fund. Universally diversified fund. It's a universal diversified fund owning 1.5 equity in 9,000 foreign companies, 70 countries. Also has fixed income, real estate, and this new unlisted investment in infrastructure for renewables. The fund has no liabilities like other pension funds do. It's fully funded, and the money Norway receives from the taxes on oil companies drilling off the coast and 67% from Equinor goes into the fund, and hence avoiding the Dutch disease. 1% of the fund's value then goes into the government budget under the fiscal rule, so that avoids also issues that can come up, and preserving the principal, because it's really based on just taking out the return. It's owned by the Norwegian people. Ministry of Finance is has a formal responsibility, but through the central bank, Norges Bank, you have the Norges Bank Investment Management, which then is a division of the central bank. It only invests abroad, so outside of Norway. And the goal is to achieve maximum possible return, moderate risk, and it's contingent on sustainable development. Long-term investment horizon, and it's intergenerational, so we're talking about benefits for this generation and future generations. It's transparent, a responsible investor, and has ethics guidelines. That's how I got into it, because I've been very focused on environmental and now more climate issues. So I'm not working for the fund in any way or any government, but this is my interest because of these ethics guidelines. And then now we talk about ESG also. So the fund has been using ESG disclosures, and NBIM has issued climate change expectations already in 2009, and they also have expectations on human rights and others, like I see here, I've written here, anti-corruption, tax and transparency, and these are based on international standards and principles from the UN and OECD. The ownership strategies as an active, and it functions as an active investor. In 2021, it had meetings with 2,600 companies, screening all of the investments against the expectations, dialogue with large companies and the ones that are weakest on disclosing ESG issues. And it voted on 11,500 meetings, annual general meetings. the vote was disclosed ahead of time, and this is pretty unusual, but that became the new way of doing it to get more support. Okay. So the idea is to invest sustainably, investment, and so they began in 2021 this pre-screening where they looked at 443 companies and they did not invest in 9 of them as a result of that pre-screening. And it also has an environment-related investment mandate, looking at low-emission energy, alternative energies, and so forth. And the new asset category, unlisted renewable energy projects. The first one was an offshore wind farm off of the Netherlands, and it's the Ørsted's Borcel 1 and 2, which producing the equivalent of 1 million households' annual power consumption. The ethics guidelines, it's been known for a long time. They were introduced in 2004, and that's a form of negative screening, and it has 2 parts. There's conduct and there's products. And under conduct, the idea is that the fund should not be invested in companies that commit human rights abuses, serious violations of human rights, and severe environmental degradation. And then a new criteria came in 2016, acts or omissions that are on aggregate company level lead to unacceptable greenhouse gas emissions. Products won't invest in tobacco, certain weapons, nuclear weapons, cluster bombs, and not coal if it's 30% or more of the income, or utility of a similar size. And furthermore, there is the Independent Ethics Council, which recommends exclusion or observation of individual companies, not countries, for breach of fundamental ethical principles. And the final decision is made by the Executive Board of Norges Bank. In Canada, these 4 companies were actually excluded based on acts or emissions, unacceptable greenhouse gas, and that was from emissions from production of oil from oil sands or tar sands, depending, in 2020. So then there's the risk-based divestment. If companies are not cooperating or changing, then divestment by Norges Bank is the final solution. If companies are not operating with sustainable business model or have high carbon context, 43 companies were divested in 2021, and this reduces the fund's exposure to unacceptable risks. It has divested from 366 companies since 2012, for instance, 60 companies due to deforestation, some 33 were palm oil companies, and over 100 oil and gas producers, but upstream only, in other words, the actual production of the oil and gas, due to oil price risk. So that's a combination of investments in oil companies, then taking into account that Norway also has Equinor. That's also a risk for the country with more oil money in there too. So the fund doesn't invest in any company in Norway, but it's all abroad. So these are the oil and gas producers upstream only. So we're now in a climate emergency, and if you picked up in April 2022, this very year, the IPCC came out with its 6th assessment report, and the Secretary General Gutierrez called it Code Red, and he said we're on a pathway to global warming, doubling the 1.5 limit agreed to in the Paris Agreement. And he also said some government and business leaders are saying one thing and doing another. He said, simply put, they're lying, and the results will be catastrophic. Investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. Climate activities are sometimes depicted as, climate activists are sometimes depicted as dangerous radicals, but the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing their production of fossil fuels. Of course, in the context of Ukraine, everybody's screaming and yelling that we need more oil and gas to replace the Russian oil and gas. So that's a quandary. However, if you put in new fossil fuel infrastructure, that's going to last for 30 to 50 years. So then you've set it all up for much more emissions of CO2. And Al Gore has talked about we're spewing 162 tons of man-made global pollution into the thin shell of our atmosphere every 20, as if it were an open sewer. And I thought that was pretty telling. So Catherine Hayhoe, a climate scientist, she's talked about how the dangers, we're looking at dangers unseen in the 10,000 years of human civilization. Efforts to make the world more resilient are needed, but that's not enough. And how people don't understand what this all means. We're talking about unprecedented, every living thing will be affected. So we're already beyond the carbon budget. Humans have pumped 36 billion tons, planet warming carbon dioxide. In 2021 alone, and 510 gigatons carbon dioxide left in the carbon budget. So if you then look at the existing fossil fuel infrastructure, we are already past what we have available. And then if you take that in addition to currently planned infrastructure, we're like way over the top of what we should be doing. So it's pretty bleak, I would say. So the timing, what's the rush? Climate change is something that's going to happen in 20 to 30 years hence. This was said by Stuart Kirk, the HSBC Bank Asset Management head in the bank, and he was speaking at a Financial Times conference, and this statement doesn't line up with the IPCC's sixth assessment report and all the other ones before it. He was actually suspended for this comment. That's according to the FT. Climate change is already here, as everybody knows. If you talk to somebody, they talked about the heat wave in India and Bangladesh, the fires in California, flooding in Europe. We have disasters in North America amounting to $415 billion in the last 3 years, mostly wildfires and hurricanes. And Swiss Re had said that this could cut the world economy by $23 trillion by 2050. So the Norwegian Commission on Climate Risk and the fund. Last year in August, this commission delivered a report on how the transition in climate risk will affect the fund. And some of this information I'm coming with now is from that report, and then Norges Bank also. So this, just to add, Lord Nicholas Stern in 2006 talked about how climate change, he characterized climate change as a result of the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. And emitters generally do not pay, and you could say we're not doing much better today. So Skanke's report talks about climate policy is, if the climate policy is changed rapidly, that can affect there can be a large transition and financial instability affecting investments value. So we need a gradual decarbonization so as one gets less risk. A well-functioning market is essential for good management of the climate risk, leading to optimal distribution of risk in the market. So, and by diversifying, you can reduce the climate risk. But late and rushed transition, that makes it much harder for spreading it. So it's really important to get started like yesterday, right, on these things, if one can possibly do that. It's a financial risk, as in climate risk is the physical, you have the physical risk, and then you have the transition risk where you get the new policies in. So the physical risk concerns the impacts on the environment, fires and drought and so forth, then affecting companies, and that's an infinite risk, whereas a transition risk, because climate change is not going away, it's going to be here forever, sadly. Risk compared to the consequences of policies, technology, and preferences, then we're talking moving to a low-carbon society, that's the transitional risk. And the extent of the irreversibility of the climate risk is a unique challenge, obviously, compared to everything else. Climate crisis doesn't follow the normal economic and political timelines. It's long-term and raises fundamental ethical questions. So you need an effective and predictable climate policy. That's essential. ESG in general, now there's nearly 2.77 trillion in assets under management. The E, of course, in ESG focuses on corporate impact on the environment, and climate has become a major focus of carbon dioxide emissions. Investors' climate risk come from the risk of the corporations they're invested in, of course. So this is why it's important to look at what those corporations are doing. And this is why I think the fund is really interesting, because it has all of these angles on how you can try and move that in the right direction. Investors need a clear view of which companies will survive given the environmental changes, regulations, and so forth. And then there is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure has developed a voluntary framework for corporate disclosure focused on impacts of climate change on the corporation. So the TCFD, was created by the Financial Stability Board. Companies need to transition to low carbon economy, and the investor needs relevant information. So you should stress test the business model against the climate policy scenarios in line with the 1.5 degrees of the Paris Agreement. So will they be profitable if you do that exercise? And then 3 options: the companies transition, they disappear, or they're taken over by other companies that are transitioning to green economy. So as far as climate risk and the fund go, the Stanko report came with some suggestions, a set of principles managing the fund's climate risk, and long-term goal of net zero emissions, further development of the bank's ownership activities, and provisions on measuring, managing, and reporting climate risk. Furthermore, active ownership influenced the corporate behavior, strengthening the functioning of the markets through better climate risk reporting, and then strengthening this measuring, managing, and reporting of the climate risk. And the bank should report regularly on the scenario analysis, shedding light on the climate risk in its own portfolio. So if you look at more international angle to this, the ambitions of successful international climate policy decreases, of course, the physical climate risks. A predictable climate policy and a gradual decarbonization is then very important, and the more you do it right, the less risk of financial instability. And of course, a huge fund like this is very dependent on having a stable financial market. And some of the tools spreading the risk, I mentioned the testing and the under active ownership, and more tools regarding how to do how the active ownership is done, and then observation and exclusion is also used if there's unacceptable, unethical behavior. Then there's this new prototype issued by the Sustainability Disclosure Standard under the International Finance Reporting Standards. That's an interesting piece that anybody who's working in this field might want to look at, because that's now evolving, moving from the TCFD, and it's an interesting project that's being worked on to make the disclosures more standardized. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anita. And I will pass over to Pablo Antolin to make some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you everybody here in person and also online to have participated in the IPRA seminar. For us, all this discussion yesterday and today highlights what we always argued, that is the essence of the OECD, which is to put in contact in the same place or virtually different stakeholders, in our case the Working Party on Private Pension, stakeholders on the pension area. And in this case, to put in contact and exchange views and ideas with academics, with researchers, thank you very much, and also with pension supervisors and regulators that are here and in person and online. And this is very important for us, and we hope to be able to host this event for years to come, and also with our colleagues from the IOPS, the International Organization of Pension Supervisors. But before finishing my concluding remarks, I will pass it on to Dariusz. I would like to thank two people. Without them, this will not be happening. First, Silke, which is in Sydney, in the University of CEPAR, and Sally, which is there in the back. The two of them are the two people that have organized the whole thing, and thanks to that, this is actually working, the Zoom, the microphones all organized, and everybody here. So thank you very much, Silke. Thank you very much, Sally. And of course, Hazel, that has been putting a lot of time in the organization of the seminar. And thank you, all of you, for being here, and all of you for being online. And hopefully we'll see each other in June next year. Thank you.
Talking after Pablo is always a pleasure, because then I can say that he's already used all the points and raised all the points, but maybe not. I will be a bit more ambitious. So, of course, I want to reiterate the thanks to the organizers and also to the speakers who agreed to come. We saw even the example of a professor who came to make 45 minutes presentation, and then he walked away again to the airport. This is a big, I would say, he could have insisted on having that in the remote version, and so we should appreciate it. I personally enjoyed all the sessions. I think that we had a very interesting overview of the history. We are somehow, some of us might feel a bit nostalgic that it's been already that long when we started with some documents that were heavily discussed. I think it's very relevant for the policymakers and the pension supervisors, because I think it shows that some of the items still need to be researched, but there are some new issues, or maybe not new issues, but still issues that require new solutions. I think that this addressing the gap is relevant not only to many members of the IOPS from other continents, but also to the changing environment in terms of labor markets, also in Europe here. I think the discussion about the new risks, or maybe new facets of the risks that are appearing due to the, for instance, COVID or the climate change, longevity changes, it calls for some new thoughts for the new products in the context of the ESG, for new metrics, and the IOPS is working on that as much as we can within our mandate. I found it interesting to see that the Norwegian fund, which is a giant market player, is issuing some sort of expectations. It's a little bit in line with our supervisory expectations concept. Now we are working in terms of the ESG. So I think that all in all, we have a lot of interesting topics that we might invite you for the next seminars, and I hope that the IPRA will be willing to pick up some of those suggestions. I think that still there's a lot of interesting things in the behavioral and fiscal incentives to make people save, or at least to start thinking about the need for the saving. The role of social pillar, which is maybe not directly linked to our table, but our colleagues from the OECD working on the employment and social issues. Definitely, there's a lot of interesting, I think, research that we would like to hear here on the non-traditional assets. We see that there is a change from the DB and DC even towards something which is like hybrid, kind of defined ambition. So it's about the risk sharing, but also about the new asset allocation. I think that inflation might be a topic. It might not fade away within a moment, and maybe next year when we will meet here, we might have some research on that. I think there are some issues which are not directly related to the pensions, or at least we think that might not be directly related, but from the perspective of the pension funds and the policymakers and supervisors, I think the issue of the long-term care and also some kind of, for instance, from the consumer protection perspective, the issue of dementia is of high importance. And the things related to the resilience of the system. So any other possible disruptions, negative or positive. So in terms of any new financial crisis, any new pandemic, or for instance, new technology. We had some chat over the dinner recently, during the recent days, that for the climate change, for instance, I think that we should also be sometimes more positive and think that there might be some solutions that are around the corner and that might change the way of doing things. So from the perspective of the research, I think there's plenty of interesting things that we would like to hear, and we are looking forward to the continued cooperation, and we really appreciate your willingness to come to Paris and share with us your knowledge and expertise. Thank you very much. And thank you for the participation online. I know it's really tough. Some of the members were waking up in like 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and I think when they come here in person, we should probably buy them some drink for that. Thank you.